Dress codes worked to cement a social hierarchy by using attire as a sign of status. Choices around fashion are always embedded in a social structure in which there are expectations. And some of those expectations are reasonable and legitimate, and some of them are unjust. I teach civil rights, and I was surprised how many cases involved dress codes, where women would resist, for instance, rules that required makeup or high-heeled shoes, dress codes that prohibited hairstyles like braided hairstyles that are typically worn by African-American women. Before this period of time, much of the clothing of elites in particular was draped clothing. Although it could signify status as well, could only do so in fairly limited ways. But when you got tailoring, and tailoring began to advance, clothing became much more expressive. So if you look at someone like Queen Elizabeth, for instance, with these very elaborate, sumptuous gowns, but they're also quite constructed so that her body seems to be a different kind of body than the body of the typical person. There was a way to communicate the authority and the majesty of royalty and aristocrats. They wanted to make sure that only people that they authorized to use this symbol of power were able to use it. And so we started to get a lot of dress codes, sumptuary laws throughout Europe that regulated clothing according to social rank. You had a class of merchants and tradespeople who were making a lot of money, and those people started to want to use these symbols of status for their own purposes. But even if they had the means, they were prohibited by these laws. Before, you'd see men in jewels, men in feathers, makeup, powdered wigs, which up till that time had been a symbol of status and power for both men and women. But during the Great Masculine Renunciation, men began to adopt this much more streamlined, sober style of clothing. That evolution expresses new egalitarian sentiments that we now associate with the Enlightenment. Social hierarchy gets reintroduced in a much more subtle way, where the way social status is expressed is through savoir-faire, through knowing the right cut, the right fabric. Right up until the early 20th century, a woman wearing a pair of pants would be in some places subject to arrest. So we don't really get what we might describe as a great feminine renunciation until the 1920s, when the flappers begin to develop this streamlined attire. And the flappers, which in today's environment, we often think of as kind of superficial and frivolous, were in fact often working women, and they were adopting clothing that was more suitable to not only work, but also to new political ideals. So this is going on at the same time the movements for women's suffrage and movements for women's equality from conventional domestic social roles. In the 1740s, for instance, there were laws in the United States that outlawed or forbade African Americans or slaves from dressing above their condition. And so the well-dressed black person was early on seen as a threat to the social order. And so when you move forward to the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century, the well-dressed African American was a visual and symbolic repudiation of white supremacy. Dignified dress was a way of demanding dignity. And so that kind of attire was an important part of the civil rights movement. Some then dressed in workwear or overalls. With the Black Panthers, for instance, it's a new sort of black aesthetic. It's an attempt to reject certain of the norms of beauty and professionalism that were advanced by white society in favor of something new. the Silicon Valley aesthetic, the gray t-shirt, the hoodie sweatshirt. In one sense, this is the logical continuation of the great masculine renunciation. Some have said, never invest in a tech company where the CEO wears a suit. So that's not expressing indifference, that's expressing a new kind of a dress code. The white man in a hoodie sweatshirt is going to be taken for someone working in tech. The black man wearing a hoodie sweatshirt might be taken for a thug or a criminal. There's no feminine version of a lot of these new dressed down types of attire, and these completely casual outfits just don't carry the same symbolic meaning for women. Kamala Harris needs to, even more than a white male, exhibit the symbolism of power. Given the difficulties already in conveying that kind of image for a woman and for a woman of color, it was reasonable for people to object that dressed down casual image kind of undermined her and undermined her authority. People are looking for something that seems unassuming, that seems kind of natural, but also still communicates status and refinement. Another thing that you see on Zoom is judgment about not just the clothing, because you can only see me from here up now, but the background. People work really hard now to stage a bookshelf in the background that perhaps has the right books. That kind of judgment's also, in a way, a form of a dress code, except now it's extended to your whole home. So we've accomplished a lot, but we're not that different from people in the past.